Let me just say a little bit more about why this is important. I mean, not just this session, but all of the sessions really in the next 5 weeks leading up to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, and why we want to get you sort of engaged, rather than me just standing here talking and then having kind of formal questions at the end, getting you involved in considering the ideas. We are living in historic times. Since 2008, we have been living in a period of deep crisis for capitalism. I mean, a crisis on the scale of the 1930s. And in great crises, like the 1930s or the long depression in the late 19th century, and now in the crisis of the present, history reaches turning points. And history can go in different directions, because a crisis imposes massive pressure, massive stress on society. And as it does that, it has the capacity to tear society apart. And the direction in which society goes will be determined by what we do. It will be determined, if we allow them to do it, by the ruling class, because they control the state, they control the corporations, they control society. If we leave them to do it, they will do it, and they will resolve the crisis in their own way at our expense. If we are going to stop them, we have to build mass movements from below. And mass movements from below mean we have to turn tens of thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of people into leaders, into people who understand the world sufficiently well and know what to do to give a lead to millions of people in the struggle to change it in the direction in which we want it to move. The crisis, if you like, tests the great classes that make up society, and that means it tests our class, it tests the working class, it tests the 80%, but that mass has to be given leadership and direction, which is why activists have to understand how history works. And also, in more detail, how our own period works. And the idea of this initial session is just to sort of get us thinking about historical mechanisms in a general sense, and then later meetings will be focusing on more specific things that are relevant to the present. That's the broad idea, really. And I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and then stop, and you're going to do some exercises, I think. Not set by me, set by others. And then I'm going to do another 20 minutes. But the idea is the whole thing is very informal and interactive. So if anybody wants to interject at any point, feel free to do that. If something is not clear, then interject, and I'll try and make it clear, because almost certainly if it's not clear to you, there'll be other people who are thinking that as well, and everybody will benefit from a fuller explanation. But we'll have more chance to explore the ideas, of course, in the group sessions as well. Let me start by saying something about cycles and arrows, because I think this is actually quite a good starting point for getting a handle on how history works at an absolutely fundamental level. See, human experience is dominated by a whole series of endlessly repeating cycles. And that's simply because we're animals, if you like, who have to make a living, who have to survive, who have to produce, who have to reproduce, and so on. So there's a sense in which a huge amount of human experience is dominated by endlessly repeating routines. But it's also true that there are arrows moving through the historical process. There are processes of change going on as well. And sometimes the cycles are dominant, and things just seem to carry on in essentially the same way without very much changing at all. And in other moments in the historical process, the arrow becomes dominant, and suddenly you can see it, and dramatic changes are happening. And there's a relationship between the two. There's a relationship between the cycles and the arrows. There is very often, within the cycles, a mole of history at work. And Marxists, they use the term dialectics to talk about the sort of understanding that they have of the historical process. And one of the key ideas of the dialectic is that you can have a long period of drip by drip by drip, quantitative change, which is almost hidden from view, hidden from consciousness, hidden from our awareness. But what's happening is there's an accumulation, a steady accumulation of changes that suddenly reaches a tipping point. And when it reaches that tipping point, there's an abrupt qualitative change. And you suddenly see the arrow of history at work. So there can be long periods of time, for example, when the discontent at the base of society is building up. But you don't see any evidence of it in mass protest and mass strikes. There's a kind of sullen resentment that is accumulating in the dark heart of the masses that reaches a point where it suddenly explodes. Now, if you like, we're seeing that happening on the streets of Greece at the moment. I suspect we will see something like that happening in Britain at some point in the fairly near future. And those of us who sort of look around the political landscape in Britain at the moment and think it's all looking pretty dead, I think will then be shocked when it suddenly explodes, as it undoubtedly will. Cycles and arrows. Strong elements of continuity and routine are part of the human experience, but so is a movement through time. So our processes have changed. Now, had I lived sort of 250 years ago, 300 years ago, and had I been talking about this, then I probably wouldn't really have had any sense of the arrows. If you had lived, I mean, if we'd been medieval peasants, sort of in the 14th century, let's say, actually our consciousness of the world would have been completely dominated by the cycles. You wouldn't have had any real sense that society ever changed very much. And the mass consciousness, actually, of people in ancient and medieval society was the sense that there is an endlessly repeating cycle, which is to do with the agricultural seasons, and it's to do with the reproduction of the family, and it's to do with the passing of the generations. No real sense, actually, that change was a dominant part of human experience. There's a dramatic shift which begins to take place in economic and social reality, and therefore in the way in which people think about the world, which begins around about 250 years ago with the Industrial Revolution. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but keep that idea of arrows and cycles in mind. Because what I want to do next by way of introduction is to talk about the three fundamental transformations, the three stages in human social development when the arrow of change is absolutely dominant and is transforming the whole of human experience. Now, my guess is that people won't be able to guess what they are, so I'm going to tell you right away. There are three great transformations in human experience. There is the agricultural revolution. There is the urban revolution, as it is sometimes called. And there is the industrial revolution. And actually, those three changes completely transform human experience. And I'm going to take them in turn and unpack them a bit, because as we unpack them, we can get to grips with some of these concepts that I see you've got a list. If you've got a list of them that you're supposed to work on subsequently, so you need to pay careful attention now as we try and unpack these three events. Let me start with the agricultural revolution. What the agricultural revolution means is, and it's perhaps worth saying about the agricultural revolution, which starts in some places about 10,000 years ago, and in other places actually doesn't happen until the 20th century. So the agricultural revolution is something that's happening at different speeds across the world. But the first agricultural revolutions, where people make the shift from being hunter-gatherers to being farmers, settled farmers, cultivating the land and domesticating animals, the first places where that shift takes place, about 10,000 years ago. It's a total transformation in human experience, and it's undertaken with reluctance. I'll tell you why it's undertaken with reluctance, because it's bloody hard work. What's much, much easier is to go out into wild nature and collect and hunt and gather what is already there. There's no hard work involved in that. I mean, anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies have shown that actually they spend most of their time just hanging around, not doing very much. They have quite a nice life, actually, hunter-gatherers, according to the anthropological studies. Farming is bloody hard work, and it means huge amounts of labour being invested in the process of clearing the land, ploughing the land, harrowing the land, sowing the land, weeding as the crops grow, harvesting the crops, grinding the cereals and so on. So it happens because society is under stress. It happens because there is global warming, almost certainly. There's a process of desiccation going on that means that the natural abundance is reducing rapidly and is no longer able to support the existing population. And people are forced then to invest labour in creating their own food supplies. Now, when they do that, something interesting happens. They begin to create surplus. Now, surplus is an absolutely fundamental concept if one is going to understand how history works. There's no surplus in a hunter-gatherer community. Hunter-gatherers just move around the landscape, and they move around with what they can carry. With agricultural settlements, it's possible to create and to store a surplus. So, for the first time in human history, we not only have people living a much harder life of hard labour to create the food supplies that they need, but also for the first time a surplus, which is then a little bit more than people need just to survive. A little bit more than basic subsistence. And you can do things with that surplus. If you go out to Salisbury Plain, you can see an example of what you can do with surplus. If you go to Stonehenge, there are these bloody great stones standing in two great stone rings in the middle of nowhere that have been hauled about 50 miles overland and erected in this place. I mean, the investment of labour time in actually creating this monument is absolutely phenomenal. Now that means it's a surplus, because the people doing all that work have not been creating food supplies. They've been consuming food supplies while they're doing it. That's a surplus. That's a social surplus that is being used to do different things than just to feed ourselves. The agricultural revolution means heavy labour, a big increase in population, and the creation of surplus. Now I'm going to move us to stage 2. My second great transformation in human experience, and introduce a couple of new concepts. My second great transformation is what is sometimes called, it's not a terribly good term, not a terribly useful term I think, but it was coined by a great Marxist archaeologist, Gordon Childe, in the interwar period. He coined the term the urban revolution. And it means more than urbanism. It means more than creating towns and cities. It means more than creating the first civilizations, though it does mean that. He was using the term to describe the emergence of something that we could describe as a civilization in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, in Egypt, in parts of what is now Pakistan, in the Yellow River Valley of China and so on, and then in other places as well. He uses it to describe this process whereby suddenly surplus is being used to create not just the occasional isolated, impressive monument, but great complexes that are controlled by a ruling class. That is, by a class of people who have control over the surplus. So that instead of the surplus being available for the use of everybody and everybody collectively deciding how to use that surplus, which is created by the agricultural revolution, the urban revolution fundamentally is about a situation where, for the first time, a minority within society has taken control over the surplus. Now, why does this happen? Well, for all sorts of complicated reasons in different circumstances, at different times, but fundamentally because the surplus is small, there are specialist roles being performed within this society, like being the priests who are in charge of the rituals and the temples and so on, or like being the war leaders when the community is under attack. A small surplus, certain specialist roles, and those specialist roles give certain people access to the surplus, control over the surplus. Now, it doesn't take very long for them to develop a material interest in retaining control of the surplus and tightening control of the surplus and increasing the amount of the surplus. And when they do that, they become exploiters. They become people whose relationship with the mass of the people producing the surplus becomes antagonistic. It becomes a relationship between a ruling class and a producing class, a relationship between a group of people at the top of society who have a specialist role and are taking advantage of that specialist role to create for themselves a position of wealth and power and relative freedom from labour and relative luxury at the top of society at the expense of those whose work is actually generating the surplus. So the urban revolution means fundamentally the creation of the first class societies in Iraq, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in Pakistan, and so on. My third turning point is the Industrial Revolution. And I'm jumping to that quite quickly, which is unfashionable, let me say, for a Marxist. I mean, what Marxists are supposed to do is spend a lot of time talking about the ancient mode of production and the feudal mode of production or the medieval mode of production. But actually, the distinctions here are secondary to these more fundamental distinctions that we're talking about. The agricultural revolution and the first surpluses, the urban revolution and the first class societies and exclusive control over surplus by a minority, and then the extraordinary transformation which is represented by the Industrial Revolution. Because I said to you a few moments ago that the cycles were dominant, the routines were dominant up to about 250 years ago. That the way in which somebody lived on the land and worked on the land in 1650, let's say, was almost exactly the same as it had been in 1600, and almost exactly the same as it had been in 1550. I mean, that was your dominant experience, social experience, from round about 250 years ago, the middle of the 18th century, in certain parts of the world and then quickly spreading to other parts of the world, there was economic takeoff. The Industrial Revolution is powered by accumulations of capital, accumulations of wealth that is not being used to invest in political competition, it's not being used to invest primarily in warfare, it's not being used in all of the complicated ways in which ruling classes before capitalism use surpluses. Capital, or the surplus as it exists in capitalist society, is being used in a very specific way, and it is to invest in increasing the productivity of labour. In other words, to invest in the development of productive technique, in the development of equipment, in order to cut costs and increase profits in an economic competition with other capitalists. And as soon as that begins to happen, as soon as that begins to take off in the middle of the 18th century, there is an explosion. There's an explosion of innovation. There's an explosion of invention. There's an explosion of new techniques, because the capital is grabbing at the new inventions, the new machines, the mechanisms that will enable the work that was previously done in a previous decade by 100 people scattered across the landscape as handloom weavers, now to be done by just one unskilled textile worker in a mill. And the whole dynamic of the system now becomes the use of surplus in this very specific way to power economic competition between different units of capital. And you get takeoff. And the arrow becomes dominant. Marx talks about this. I forgot to bring the quotation with me, but there's a wonderful passage in Marx's Communist Manifesto, which is, you know, recommended, very much strongly recommended further reading, where he talks about the way in which the bourgeoisie, the new capitalist class, transforms human experience, whereas all previous ruling classes had been dominated by an essentially conservative approach to life. The bourgeoisie is constantly revolutionizing the means of production, constantly transforming the nature of social reality, constantly investing in new ideas, in social change, so that all that is solid melts into air, he says. So there's a fundamental shift in human experience which begins with the Industrial Revolution. I've got 5 minutes to go. Okay.
For the first part.
That's perfect.
Good.
3 great transformations, and associated with each of those transformations a significant change in human experience. The agricultural revolution and surplus. The urban revolution and the creation of classes and exploitation and exclusive control over surplus. The industrial revolution and the development of a distinctive form of class society based on economic competition between units of capital. Let me finish the first session by addressing a question of definition which is relevant to what we've been talking about. We use 4 terms when we're trying to get a handle on how a particular social system at any point in time actually works. We talk about forces of production. And by forces of production we really mean the machines, the intelligence, the understanding, the know-how, the knowledge, all of those things that are contributing to our ability to produce wealth. That's forces of production. We talk about means of production. And that's how these forces of production, these ideas about technique, these ideas about production have been turned into workplaces, factories, machines, farms, estates, or whatever it is. We talk about relations of production. And what we have in mind there is the social relationships which exist between the human beings who are part of the productive process, who are part of the economic system. The social relations between the ruling class, that in one period might be a feudal landowning class that controls the land, and a producing class made up of peasants. Or in another period, in our own period, a capitalist class that controls the factories and the supermarkets and the call centres and so on, and a proletariat and a working class that works within them. Relations of production, social relations of production. And we talk about all of those things together constituting a mode of production. That if you think about the forces of production and how they've been turned into means of production, in other words, the possibilities that you have for producing in a particular period, and how you then turn those into means of production, and how you create relationships, social relationships between people associated with that process, you have a mode of production, a way in which society as a whole is working in order to produce the things that people actually need to make a living. That's enough to kick off.
Yeah, that's great.